A man wakes up in an unremarkable parking lot in Germany, which 74 years prior was known as Führerbunker, where the Nazis' top brass in World War II waited out their final days. He's got a splitting headache, almost like he'd been shot in the head, and a strange little toothbrush mustache. The year is 2022 and Adolf Hitler has just come back to life. We can say for certain after his headache fades away, the next thing he'll feel is utter confusion. The world in 2022 looks incredibly different than it did in 1945 in pretty much every conceivable way. The fashions have changed, social attitudes have evolved, there's been another global pandemic, and technology has advanced dramatically. So before he could react to anything specific to his own personal views, he'd probably be pretty overwhelmed by the appearance of electric cars, flat-screen TVs, and smartphones. It would take quite some time for him to get used to the fact that most people have tiny computers in their pocket that function as phones and an access point to the entire knowledge of our species. Once he recovered from the shock of absorbing all the technological changes of the last 7 decades or so, Hitler would be pretty upset with just about everything he saw and learned about the state of the country he used to run. At the end of World War II, his last glimpse at Germany, the country was in ruins. Its ports and railroads had been decimated by bombs, the population had been wiped out by war and his own genocides alike, and it seemed as if it might never recover. Now, Germany is considered to be a thriving and widely trusted nation on a global scale. Though Hitler would likely be glad to see his homeland doing well, he would be furious about everything else the nation was doing, and has been doing since his death. First, he would see that the flag being flown by the nation of Germany has changed in his absence. When the Nazi Party rose to power in 1933, the traditional black, red, and gold German flag was discarded, and 2 new national flags were chosen: a black, red, and white flag, and the horribly recognizable swastika flag of the Nazi Party. In 1935, the shift toward Nazism was made complete, and the swastika flag took its place as the nation's only official flag. After the fall of the Third Reich and the end of Hitler's regime, the flag was returned to its original black, red, and gold self. This marked the end of the darkest period in Germany's history, and it would make Hitler absolutely furious. This is far from the only way in which Germany has attempted to undo the damage done by the Nazi Party, both to itself and to the world at large. In March of 2015, Chancellor Angela Merkel discussed the lingering effects of the war on the nation's identity, saying, "We Germans will never forget the hand of reconciliation that was extended to us after all the suffering that our country had brought to Europe and the world." Speaking of Chancellor Merkel, Hitler would be infuriated if he happened to wander into a bar and see her on the TV, leading the country as its first female chancellor. Women under the Nazi regime were prohibited from holding executive office or taking any influential role in politics. They were expected to stay home and act only as wives and mothers, giving up all other responsibilities aside from supporting their husbands and having as many German babies as possible. Not only does Merkel not have any children, but she holds the highest political office in Germany. Hitler would demand that that bar's proprietor change the channel to something else, and when the TV flipped to an international news channel, he would be angry to see that England recovered from the Blitz, and Poland is its own country and still exists, with its own beautiful cultural achievements, in spite of the damage done to it in World War II. Hitler would snatch the TV remote from the bar's owner and continue flipping through the channels, looking for something, anything that might indicate the lasting effects of his regime. He would not like what he found. As someone who was big on censorship, with the Nazi Party devoting countless time and resources to propaganda and crushing all dissenting opinions, the freedom of international and German media would come as quite a shock. Starting in 1934, it was illegal to criticize the Nazi government or even joke about Hitler. Doing so was considered a form of treason. Anti-Nazi newspapers were closed down, radio broadcasts and print media were controlled, and propaganda was produced to glorify Hitler and the Nazi Party as a whole. He would turn to a channel where a sitcom was making fun of him and demand to know why that was allowed. Everyone he asked would just laugh at him, and his face got redder and redder, and he could do nothing to stop them. You can only imagine his blood-boiling rage when he finds out that the iconic and beloved Jewish comedians like Mel Brooks and Charlie Chaplin have made millions with clever jabs at the Big Bad Führer in movies like The Producers and The Great Dictator, both of which are enjoyed just as much in Germany as anywhere else. It's not just acceptable to joke about Hitler or openly criticize him now. Freedom of the press is a high priority in Germany and protected by its constitution. The Press Freedom Index, compiled by the NGO Reporters Without Borders, ranks Germany in the top 20 countries for free press, placing it well above the United States and the United Kingdom. Berlin, Hitler's old stomping grounds, is one of the top 10 media cities in the world, with 440 correspondents from 60 different countries reporting on its soil. The German Press Council, made up of publishing and journalism associations, works to maintain free access to information as well as journalistic ethics in the country, helping to ensure that nothing like the censorship under the Third Reich happens again. Finished with television, Hitler would storm out of the bar, back out to the streets, and make his way to a local library. Maybe he could find some good Nazi literature or his own book Mein Kampf to cheer him up. Instead, he'd be shocked at the wide variety of volumes on shelves, covering all manners of topics once banned under his own authority. The Nazi Party conducted a series of infamous book burnings, targeting books in Germany and Austria in the 1930s. The initial wave of targets included those by Jewish, communist, socialist, anarchist, and pacifist authors, including the works of writers like Albert Einstein, Helen Keller, Victor Hugo, Jack London, and Leo Tolstoy. Eventually, anyone who was not a vocal supporter of Nazism was a target, and their books were burned. Hitler would fly into a rage seeing a copy of Hugo's Les Miserables on display, or a copy of Tolstoy's War and Peace. These books were meant to be eradicated from German soil, but time marched on and you can't fight the written word. Just imagine what someone so insistent on fighting for traditional values would think of 50 Shades of Grey. But he wouldn't stay focused on the fiction section long, because there's been progress in Germany far more notable and more upsetting to Hitler than the inclusion of classic literature and political theory in its libraries. One particularly tragic target of Nazi book burnings was the Institute for Sexual Science, founded in 1919 by Magnus Hirschfeld. The institute conducted research into human gender and sexuality, covering a wide variety of topics from health and safety to public sex education. It was especially notable for its, at the time, groundbreaking studies of individuals in the gay community. It also acted as the home of the Scientific Humanitarian Committee and the World League for Sexual Reform. Tragically and predictably, the Nazi Party was not fond of Hirschfeld or his institute, declaring it offensive and targeting him for his Jewish identity. Nazis overtook the institute in 1933, where they burned the contents of the library as Hirschfeld was exiled in France. The buildings were destroyed completely by a bombing in 1943, and countless volumes of research and progress were lost forever. Today, however, things are quite different. Germany prioritizes sex education, which was made mandatory in 1992. Gay rights have also come a long way since the time of World War II and the loss of the Institute for Sexual Science. Today, there's no censorship of gay people in German media. Discrimination for employment or housing access on the basis of sexual orientation is illegal. Conversion therapy is banned, and same-sex marriage has been legal since 2017. Germany is a more diverse place than it was when Hitler was in power, in spite of all his efforts and the efforts of those like him. Of the 82 million people living in Germany, over 19 million of them come from an immigrant background. 9.6 million people are living with a disability. There are hundreds of different religious communities, and the nation's constitution guarantees freedom of faith and the right to practice one's religion. Running down the street, increasingly upset and desperate to get away, Hitler would find himself surrounded by all of the people he once tried to erase from Germany altogether, walking around him and just going about their lives, happy, while he grows more and more miserable. Out of breath, he'd stop and look around him at the city of Berlin. When he last saw it, it was a city in ruins, destroyed by the ravages of war. The Brandenburg Gate, once crumbling to pieces, stands fully restored. The Reichstag looks new, now the seat of German parliament, and a place for tourists to pose for pictures. Some spots, however, have been left as they were. The Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, damaged during a bombing in 1943, was deliberately left alone after the war. Throughout the city, the old and the new, there are memorial sites and informational panels commemorating the horrors of the Holocaust and pointing out the buildings that were once occupied by the Third Reich. The city has been rebuilt, but its history will never be forgotten. He might start screaming and ranting, as he was known to do, yelling about the horrors and evils of racial diversity, of sexual liberation, of gender equality, of free speech, understanding, and tolerance. In his mind, he'd be the last man standing up for what he believes in. To anyone else, he just looked like some mad old fool in a tasteless costume. And finally, Hitler's terrible, horrible, no-good, very bad day would end with him being hauled off to jail by the German police. You see, in Germany, the law bans symbols of anti-constitutional organizations and has strict laws against displaying them in public. Nazi salutes or positive statements about Hitler also fall under the designation. Displaying Nazi iconography, such as a Hitler costume or a swastika armband in public, can result in up to 3 years in prison, or 5 if the hateful display is considered to be inciting violence against a specific racial or religious group. Naturally, a man making his way down the streets of contemporary Berlin in full Nazi uniform and bearing an uncanny resemblance to Adolf Hitler would draw quite a bit of negative attention, especially with his ranting and raving. People would be taking pictures for Twitter, live streaming on Instagram, and calling the local police. Someone might throw an empty coffee cup at him. Someone might throw a full coffee cup at him. Others would cover their child's eyes. Hitler could try to run, he could try to hide, he would find himself brought in for questioning. After a short conversation with the man, no officer in their right mind would release him back out into Germany at large. He would receive the maximum sentence and likely be given a psychological evaluation as well. So, if Adolf Hitler woke up today and found himself in the present, he would see how the world has moved on without him and done its best to make sure no one like him ever wins again. And he'd end the day the same way he ended the war, terrified, defeated, and locked away. And let's be honest, there's no way he's getting out for good behavior.